Hi, second grade. All right, so the first read aloud that I'm going to read to you today is called Cinderella. And this is probably the version that a lot of us are familiar with when we think about Disney princesses. But I thought that it would be a good idea for us to re-listen to this story so that we're very familiar with it in case there are some details that we forgot. So all I really need you to do, your job during this read aloud, is just kind of remember, listen, pay attention to the characters, what's happening to the characters, and where it takes place. All right, so just sit back, relax, and let me read you the story about Cinderella, a Disney princess. And one thing that I do want to comment on that I'm just thinking about now is that this version is actually from French culture. So this story it started in France. So if you've ever been to France, this is kind of where this story, this version of Cinderella begins. So that's very important to know. All right, so let's start. Cinderella. Once upon a time, a girl named Cinderella lived in a faraway land with her devoted father, a widower. He remarried so Cinderella could have a stepmother and stepsisters. But when her father died suddenly, Cinderella discovered that her stepmother, Lady Tremaine, was cold, cruel, and bitterly jealous of Cinderella's charm and beauty. After some time passed, Cinderella became a servant in her own home, but she still dreamed of her happiness. Despite how her stepfamily treated her, she remained ever gentle and kind, especially to animals, her devoted friends. One morning, Cinderella rescued a new mouse from a trap. She gave him clothes and named him Gus. Jacques, she said to another mouse, maybe you'd better explain things to him. Don't forget to warn him about the cat. Cinderella left Gus with Jacques and began her chores. The first order of business was to give Lucifer, Lady Tremaine's cat, his breakfast. Gus wasn't afraid of the cat. While the water heated for her stepfamily's tea, Cinderella fed the animals in the yard. The mice were eager to get their share. But Lucifer was blocking the doorway. The mice drew tails to see who would distract the cat so the others would dash outside. It was up to Jacques. He crept towards Lucifer and kicked the cat's leg out from under him. Splash! Lucifer fell into his milk bowl. Lucifer chased Jacques all over the room, and Jacques hid in the wall where Lucifer couldn't get to him. He waved his hat to the other mice to know that it was safe for them to go get their breakfast. Cinderella had been waiting for the mice. Breakfast is served, she said when they appeared. She scattered plump kernels of corn on the ground. When Gus went back inside, he found himself face to face with Lucifer. Lucifer trapped Gus under the 3 teacups. Just as he began lifting the cups, the bell rang. Lady Tremaine and her daughters wanted their breakfast right away. Lucifer ducked under the tablecloth when Cinderella came inside to get the breakfast trays ready. He waited for the right moment to snatch Gus. But that moment never came. Cinderella whisked the trays off, unaware she carried a slow away. Cinderella, Cinderella, Lady Tremaine and her daughters, Anastasia and Drizella, called shrilly from their bedrooms. Coming, coming, Cinderella yelled. Shortly after Cinderella had delivered breakfast, Anastasia shrieked when she found Gus under her cup. She called for her mother and pointed at Cinderella. You did it on purpose, she said. Cinderella was summoned back to Lady Tremaine's room. It seems we have time on our hands, Lady Tremaine said. Time for vicious practical jokes. Perhaps we can put it to better use. She gave Cinderella a long list of extra chores, including giving Lucifer a bath. Meanwhile, at the palace, the king was upset that the prince was still unmarried. He told the Grand Duke to invite every eligible maiden to a ball so his son could find a bride. An invitation to the ball came to the house that very day. Lady Tremaine read it out loud. By royal command, every eligible maiden is to attend. And her daughters squealed with excitement. And I'm so eligible, said Anastasia. Why, that means I can go too, exclaimed Cinderella. Anastasia and Drizella sneered at her, but Lady Tremaine agreed Cinderella could go if she finished her chores and found something suitable to wear. In the attic, Cinderella found an old dress. Isn't it lovely? She asked her friends. It's my mother's, she considered it. Maybe it is a little old-fashioned, but oh, I'll fix that. Just then her step-family called. Cinderella's stepsisters tossed armloads of garments at her. Each one, they declared, needed mending and ironing at once. Lady Tremaine gave her even more chores. Meanwhile, the mice and the birds retrieved the stepsisters' discarded sash and beads, some of the stitching and some with folding. They turned Cinderella's simple dress into a fabulous ball gown. With no time to get ready, Cinderella gazed out her window at the shining palace. I suppose it would be frightfully dull, she said, trying to comfort herself, and completely wonderful. Suddenly, Cinderella saw her new dress. Surprise! Squeaked the mice. Why, it's such a surprise! Oh, thank you so much! Cinderella exclaimed. When Anastasia and Drizella saw Cinderella, they flew into a jealous rage. Why, you little thief! Anastasia exclaimed. They ripped the dress, pulling off the sash and yanking the beads. Lady Tremaine just stood and watched. Now Cinderella had no hope of going to the ball and meeting the prince. She ran, heartbroken, from the garden and sobbed. There's nothing left to believe in, she said. Nothing. But you don't really believe that, child, a comforting voice said. Cinderella's fairy godmother had appeared. You'd lost all your faith. I couldn't be here. Cinderella hadn't given up on her dreams after all. Cinderella's fairy godmother insisted that Cinderella was going to the ball. She waved her magic wand and turned a simple pumpkin into an elegant coach and mice into horses. The fairy godmother pointed her magic wand at Cinderella and said, Bippity-boppity-boo! Suddenly, Cinderella was wearing a beautiful dress and sparkling glass slippers. It's like a dream, Cinderella said as she prepared to leave for the ball. Like all dreams. Well, I'm afraid this one can't last forever. Her grandmother explained that Cinderella must be home before midnight when everything would change back. At the palace, one young woman after another were called to step forward and meet the prince. The king couldn't understand why the prince wasn't interested in any of these girls. Anastasia and Drizella took their turns together. They curtsied before the prince, but he was looking at someone behind them. Cinderella had appeared at the end of the hall, and the prince hurried to her side. She was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. She was the one he had been waiting for. After many dances, the prince took Cinderella for a moonlit stroll across the bridge. The two were falling in love. Cinderella had lost track of time. It was nearly midnight. Goodbye, Cinderella called to the prince as she hurried away. Both the prince and the Grand Duke tried to stop her, but Cinderella ran off, losing a glass slipper along the way. Cinderella hurried back to the transformed pumpkin, and the Grand Duke cried, Follow that coach! Cinderella's horses galloped away with the king's men in pursuit. Then the clock struck midnight. Everyone and everything returned to normal, but Cinderella still had one glass slipper. She smiled and thanked her fairy godmother for a magical evening. But at the palace, the Grand Duke told the king that the girl his son had loved had vanished. Furious at the Duke's words, the king yelled, "Traitor! Sabotage! I tried to stop her," said the Grand Duke. "All we could find was the glass slipper." The king demanded the glass slipper to be used to find the girl. The next morning, Cinderella overheard Lady Tremaine telling her daughters that the Grand Duke was searching for the girl who had lost the glass slipper. Whoever fit the slipper perfectly would marry the prince. Cinderella went to her room, not quite believing what she had heard. The prince had fallen in love with her, just as she had fallen in love with him, and then Lady Tremaine appeared. Without saying a word, Lady Tremaine locked Cinderella in her room and pocketed the key. She had realized Cinderella was the girl that the prince was searching for. "Let me out!" cried Cinderella, but Lady Tremaine ignored her. When the Grand Duke arrived, Lady Tremaine and her daughters hurried to greet him. You honor our humble home. May I present to you my daughters?" Lady Tremaine hoped one of her daughters would fit in the slipper. While the Grand Duke explained that every maiden in the kingdom must try on the glass slipper, Gus and Jacques managed to get the key to Cinderella's room. Each of the stepsisters tried to squeeze her big foot into the delicate little slipper, but it was no use. It was always perfectly fit before, Anastasia said. As the Grand Duke was about to leave, Cinderella appeared at the top of the stairs. Her animal friends had freed her just in time. "Your Grace, may I try it on?" she asked. Lady Tremaine tripped the footman, and the glass slipper shattered before Cinderella could try it on, but Cinderella still had the other slipper in her pocket. It was a perfect fit. Cinderella and the prince were married to the delight of the king and all of Cinderella's animal friends. Cinderella's dreams had come true at last. She and her prince lived happily ever after. The end. All right, second graders, that is the end of version 1. So I hope that you enjoyed this story and get ready to listen to the second one. All right. Bye.